They called me into the conference room at 9:30 sharp. I thought it would be a strategy session, maybe even a chance to pitch the project I'd been refining for months. Instead, I walked in and froze. My new manager sat at the head of the table, slicing a banana with a flimsy plastic knife, like it was some kind of performance. He didn't even look at me, just smirked, chewing slowly as if to say, "You're already dismissed," before you've spoken a word. Behind him, the screen lit up with the new organizational chart. My name had been shoved down to the bottom, boxed into a special assignment I'd never asked for. Everyone knew what that meant. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't even neutral. It was exile wrapped in a shiny label. I remember my stomach tightening, my pulse pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to shout, to demand why years of building systems, fixing mistakes, and carrying projects on my back had been reduced to this humiliating footnote. But I kept my face still. I stayed silent, because sometimes silence cuts deeper than any outburst. In that moment, staring at a man with a plastic knife, pretending to have power, I realized something. They thought they'd buried me in the data. They didn't know I had already memorized the map of every hidden crack in the system. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you tuning in from? And let me ask you this. Have you ever been treated like you were disposable at work? Leave a comment if this brings back a memory. Sharing your story might remind someone else that they're not alone. They didn't call it a demotion. Of course they wouldn't. They wrapped it in polished words, the kind that sound impressive on paper, but feel like sandpaper when you hear them out loud. "Rachel, we'd like you to take ownership of a new initiative," Brad said, still holding that ridiculous plastic knife like it was a pointer. "Customer retention metrics, a critical piece of our future strategy." I nodded, but inside my chest, I felt the floor tilt. I had been designing the architecture that kept entire systems running, the invisible framework holding the company together. Now I was being handed what everyone in the room knew was a trash project. Retention metrics weren't strategy, they were a dumping ground. The kind of work managers use when they don't want to fire you, but also don't want you in the way. What stung the most wasn't even the task itself. It was the way people reacted. A few colleagues avoided my eyes. One gave me that tight little smile that says, "Better you than me." And Brad, he leaned back like a man who had just rearranged the chessboard. In that moment, I kept asking myself, do they really think I don't notice? Did they believe I'll just fade quietly into this corner they've built for me? The truth is, they did. They believed the polite language, the shiny new initiative, was enough to make me swallow humiliation. I took the assignment folder with steady hands, outwardly calm, inwardly burning. I told myself, fine, if they want me buried in the data, I'll go deeper than they expect. And when you go deep enough, you don't just find numbers, you find the cracks no one wants to admit are there. That thought alone kept me steady as I walked out of the conference room. My so-called new role wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of something they would never see coming. The first thing I did after that meeting was open the new dashboard they had so proudly rebranded. Customer Insight 2.0 flashed across the screen in bold colors like a marketing ad. At first glance, it looked great. Too great. Churn numbers neatly rounded, bright green arrows pointing down, suggesting we were saving more clients than ever. But numbers don't just magically improve overnight. Not in this industry. Not with the clients I knew were already frustrated. My gut told me something was off, and I've learned to trust that instinct. I pulled up the archived version of my old dashboard, the one I had built from scratch. The churn rate there was 8.2%. Ugly but honest. On Customer Insight 2.0, it was 5.6%. A gap that wide wasn't just a rounding error, it was a warning sign. I started clicking through the filters. The categories were simplified, entire client groups bundled together. That's when I noticed it. 4 of our biggest enterprise accounts were simply gone. They weren't listed as lost, they weren't even in the dataset. It was as if they had vanished. My chest tightened. I knew those accounts. I'd worked late nights solving their issues, patching integrations, keeping their system stable. They didn't just disappear. Someone had erased them from the story. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. This wasn't just sloppy reporting. This was deliberate, a paint job over a cracked wall. Still, I couldn't jump to conclusions. If I wanted the truth to mean something, I needed proof, real proof. Not suspicion, not gut feeling, hard evidence. So I started recording. Screen captures, logs, copies of CSVs, every small detail that didn't line up. If they wanted to bury me in the data, fine. I'd make the data my weapon. And as the hours ticked by, one thing became clear. The numbers might be manipulated, but the truth always leaves a trace. I knew if I confronted them too soon, they'd twist it back on me. They'd call me emotional, say I misunderstood the numbers, maybe even accuse me of sabotaging the system I built. No, I couldn't give them that chance. If I wanted the truth to speak, I had to let the data speak for itself. That night, I created a hidden folder on my personal drive. I named it Echo Files. The idea was simple. Everything they tried to erase, I would echo back. Every change, every deletion, every suspicious log entry. If they wanted silence, I would make sure there was a record that whispered louder than any excuse. Each day, I recorded my screen as I worked. OBS captured every click, every filter I toggled. I saved raw CSV exports, hashed them, and tucked them away in the folder. I even wrote little notes to myself in plain text, short reminders like, check segment C, flattening taxonomy, July 12th. On the surface, they looked like nothing, but strung together, they built a timeline that couldn't be ignored. There was something strangely calming about it. While the office buzzed with fake optimism and people toasted imaginary wins, I sat quietly building my archive. Piece by piece, my folder grew heavier. It wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was focus. Cold, steady focus. Sometimes, as I watched the progress bar crawl while saving another massive file, I asked myself, why am I the only one seeing this? Why isn't anyone else speaking up? But deep down, I already knew the answer. Most people don't want to see the cracks. They'd rather believe the paint job. I couldn't afford that luxury anymore. By the end of the week, Echo Files had become a vault, a silent record of everything they wanted buried. I didn't know when I would use it or how, but I knew this much. When the time came, those files would speak louder than any voice in the boardroom. And then something unexpected happened. Someone outside my team noticed the same inconsistency. That was the first sign I wasn't alone in this fight. It started with a Slack message that wasn't even meant for me. Darren from billing dropped a note in the wrong channel. Invoice totals don't line up with churn report. Off by 6 figures. Am I missing something? I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just me anymore. Someone else had noticed. I didn't reply, not directly, but I made sure the old report link, the one with the real numbers, was still sitting in Confluence, tucked neatly under archived documents. A breadcrumb waiting to be found. Later that afternoon, I overheard a conversation near the coffee machine. Ja from legal was asking about an obscure clause in our contracts, something about retention benchmarks. His tone was casual, but I caught the edge in his voice. Legal doesn't go digging unless they smell smoke. That night, I scrolled through Slack threads, watching tiny sparks catch. A junior analyst dropped an emoji under a chart that looked too perfect. Another manager asked, "Did segment C vanish, or am I losing my mind?" On the surface, it all looked harmless, noise. But I knew better. Noise was where the truth started leaking. Every little slip, every raised eyebrow was a quiet reminder I wasn't crazy. They were seeing it too. The difference was they didn't have the whole picture. They didn't know about echo files or the recordings or the vanished clients I had already logged. I kept my role small, almost invisible. I didn't argue, didn't preach. I just nudged, dropping a link here, an old chart there. Nothing that pointed back to me, but enough to feed their doubts. The office air shifted. You could feel it. Conversations that used to be full of fake cheer now carried hesitation. People laughed too quickly, voices trailed off mid-sentence. The cracks were spreading, and I didn't even have to push. And then, one morning, an email arrived that changed everything. It wasn't from Darren or Jaw or anyone I expected. It was from finance. And it wasn't just a question, it was a warning. The email from finance wasn't long, but it carried weight. Numbers aren't reconciling. Need a second opinion. Can you access the Anchor system? Anchor? That was the raw source, the foundation under every dashboard and chart. Normally, access to it was locked behind layers of approvals. I shouldn't have had any reason to touch it. But finance had given me an opening, and I wasn't going to waste it. When I requested temporary credentials, data ops pushed back. "Rachel, you know Anchor isn't part of your scope anymore." I kept my voice steady. If we're making decisions based on churn, we need clean baselines. Give me 1 week. After that, revoke it. There was a pause, the kind where you can almost hear someone calculating risk. Then, the email landed in my inbox. Access granted. Expires in 7 days. 7 days. That was all I had. The countdown began immediately in my head. Every day mattered. Every hour. I started pulling exports, comparing the so-called Customer Insight 2.0 numbers against the untouched Anchor logs. The gaps weren't small. They were gaping wounds. On one export, the churn gap showed negative 12% variance. That's not noise. That's manipulation. I worked quietly long after the office had emptied. My desk light glowing, the hum of servers in the background, the progress bar crawling across the screen. With every new file, my Echo Files folder grew heavier. But with each discovery, the pressure mounted. I could feel the walls closing in, the invisible clock ticking louder. What if they realized I had access? What if they pulled the plug before I was done? Still, fear didn't outweigh clarity. For the first time since my so-called promotion, I felt like I had leverage, real leverage. On the 7th evening, as I zipped the final archive and watched the timestamp burn itself into the metadata, a notification popped up on Slack. It wasn't from finance this time. It was from Jenna the controller, and her message wasn't a request, it was a red flag. The Slack message from Jenna the controller was short but urgent. "We can't balance the forecast. 4 enterprise renewals are missing. Meet now." Within minutes, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, the kind where whispers echo louder than shouts. Jenna's laptop screen faced the group. Red cells everywhere. Numbers that should have aligned were miles apart. Her voice was tight. "We've lost 4 major clients, but the churn dashboard still shows improvement. Do you understand how bad this looks?" Nobody spoke. People glanced at each other, waiting for someone else to take the fall. Brad wasn't there. Cam wasn't there. Just mid-level managers, wide-eyed and silent. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a flicker of grim validation. This was the crack widening. What I had seen in the data was no longer just my burden. It was now finance's nightmare. Jenna exhaled sharply, snapping the silence. "We are not looking for blame right now. We are looking for solutions. But if we go into the board meeting with these gaps, it's our credibility on the line." That word credibility hung in the air. It was the one thing finance people fear losing more than money itself. I slid a 1-page printout across the table, careful not to overshare. It was an anonymized comparison, churn data from Anchor versus the dashboard. Just enough to show the pattern. "This might help," I said quietly. Her eyes scanned the sheet. For a moment, the room was still. Then Jenna nodded, almost imperceptibly. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't want to know. But I could tell she understood. The meeting ended with vague action items and forced optimism, but the panic was undeniable. As I walked back to my desk, messages were already flying across Slack. The tone had shifted. Less cheerleading, more fear. That night, I opened Echo Files again. My vault was full, but now the company itself was starting to provide the evidence for me. And just as I thought I had a moment to breathe, another surprise landed in my inbox, this time not from finance at all. It started with a message that looked like a joke. A junior analyst, probably exhausted after another late night, typed into the general channel, "We didn't fix churn. We just renamed it LOL." At first, it seemed harmless, a throwaway comment buried in the constant flood of pings and emojis. But then, someone reacted with the wide-eyed emoji. Another person added a nervous laugh. Within minutes, the message had been screenshotted, shared into side channels, and dissected in private DMs. I sat at my desk watching it unfold in real time. The post was deleted after 10 minutes, but by then, it was too late. In a company running on Slack, nothing ever really disappears. The screenshot had taken on a life of its own. By lunch, whispers had turned into full-blown speculation. People were asking questions out loud that they'd only dared to think before. Why does the churn line look so clean? Did we actually lose segment C? Are we cooking the books? No one had answers, but the air was thick with suspicion. Meetings that should have been routine felt tense. Smiles were tighter. Even Brad's booming voice in the hallway didn't carry the same confidence. You could feel the ground shifting under everyone's feet. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was slipping through on its own, like water through cracked glass. All I had to do was let the noise spread. And it did, fast, loud, and uncontrollable. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. A leak like this could just as easily backfire. If leadership decided to make an example out of someone, the blame might land on whoever looked most convenient. And I'd already been marked once. So I stayed quiet, eyes on my screen, building echo files while the company buzzed with rumors. Because the real storm hadn't even arrived yet. That storm would come when the all-hands meeting rolled around and Cam stepped onto the stage. The auditorium was packed. Every seat taken, every laptop balanced on knees, Slack notifications buzzing in pockets. It was the monthly all-hands, and this time the tension was different. No one was here for free bagels or motivational slides. Everyone was waiting for Cam. When he finally walked on stage, he carried himself like nothing was wrong. Confident smile, clicker in hand, the kind of posture you practice in front of a mirror. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice booming. "Let's talk about our progress." The first slides were polished, all bright colors and bold arrows pointing up. Applause came, but it was thin, uncertain. People clapped because that's what they were supposed to do, not because they believed it. Then came the churn slide. On the big screen, the number glowed 6.1%. Cam's voice didn't waver. "We've made incredible progress in customer retention. This is proof that our strategy is working." But almost instantly, the dashboard updated. A live sync from Anchor. The green number flickered, then dropped. 6.1% became 12.7%. A second later, it jumped again. 18.4%. Gasps rippled across the room. Fingers froze above keyboards. A single sharp cough echoed like thunder. Cam's smile faltered. He clicked frantically, but the numbers wouldn't change. The system was syncing in real time, exposing everything he had tried to hide. From the front row, the CEO's voice cut through the silence. "Why wasn't I told about this?" No one answered. Cam's face flushed crimson. His practiced confidence was gone, replaced with the look of a man cornered. I sat in the middle row, heart steady. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't have to say a word. The data was speaking louder than any of us. The room buzzed with whispers, phones buzzing with screenshots, the unraveling too big to stop. Everyone was watching the numbers collapse. Everyone was watching Cam fall apart. And I knew, as the CEO's eyes scanned the room, the storm was just beginning. The morning after the all-hands felt like stepping into a different company. The hallways were quieter, the usual chatter replaced by cautious whispers. People typed softer, as if afraid the sound of their keyboards might draw attention. By noon, the email came down from legal. Subject line: immediate review, data integrity, and reporting. It wasn't optional. Everyone tied to metrics, forecasting, or client renewals was required to submit documentation. They called it a review, but everyone knew what it really was: an audit. In the meeting room, legal took over like storm clouds rolling in. Folders, clipboards, endless questions. Their tone wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was surgical, precise. Who approved the dashboard changes? Where is the source data? Who signed off on quarterly forecasts? Every question was a scalpel slicing closer to the truth. Cam tried to posture, but his voice cracked under the weight. Brad looked smaller than usual, his booming laugh gone. People who used to speak with certainty now stumbled over their words, hiding behind jargon that only made them look guiltier. I sat in silence, hands folded, letting the storm rage around me. Inside, I felt a strange calm. Every breadcrumb I had collected in echo files was lining up perfectly with the questions being asked. They didn't know it yet, but I had already mapped the trail they were chasing. What struck me most was how quickly the atmosphere shifted. Just days ago, leadership had strutted through the office with confidence. Now, every eye flickered with fear of being the one holding the bag when legal closed in. At the end of the session, one of the attorneys paused, scanning the room, before saying, "We'll need to speak with several of you individually." I knew it was only a matter of time before they came to me. And sure enough, later that afternoon, Lauren, from the executive team, appeared at my desk with a calm smile. "Rachel," she said softly, "the CEO would like to have a word with you." Lauren led me down the quiet hallway past rows of glass offices. The chatter of the floor faded until all I could hear was the clicking of her heels and the steady rhythm of my own breath. At the end of the hall was a frosted glass door. She opened it without knocking. The CEO was waiting. No slides, no assistants, no audience, just him sitting at a small round table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. He gestured for me to sit. "Rachel," he began, his tone measured. "We've had some revelations in the past 24 hours. I didn't reply. I just waited steady, letting the silence stretch. He leaned forward. "You've been close to this data for years. You understand its architecture better than anyone here. So tell me, how deep does this go?" The question hung heavy. I thought about the Echo Files folder, about every screenshot, every CSV, every breadcrumb neatly aligned in my archive. I could drop it all on the table right now, let the storm swallow everyone involved. But something in me hesitated. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew the weight it carried. Instead, I answered carefully. "The cracks aren't surface level, they're structural. You've been making decisions on numbers that were never real." For a moment, he said nothing. He just tapped a finger against the coffee cup, as if measuring my words against what he already suspected. Finally, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "If we bring you back in, if we give you full access and authority, can you fix this?" I looked him in the eye. "Not unless I set the terms." That was when the air shifted. His expression hardened, not in anger, but in recognition. He knew I wasn't bargaining out of ego. I was bargaining out of necessity. He leaned back, exhaling. "Then tell me your terms." And in that instant, I realized the balance of power had shifted completely. For the first time, I wasn't at their mercy. They were at mine. I didn't hand over everything that day, not at once. I let the truth unfold in layers, the same way it had revealed itself to me, through files, through logs, through undeniable patterns. Legal followed the trail, finance confirmed the damage, and eventually Cam and Brad had nowhere left to hide. Their polished smiles couldn't cover the numbers anymore. Within weeks, both were quietly removed. No farewell speeches, no applause. Just names erased from the directory, as if they had never been there at all. As for me, the offer to return came fast. A bigger title, more authority, a direct line to the CEO. But I didn't say yes immediately. For the first time, I realized I wasn't desperate for their validation. I had leverage, and leverage gave me choices. I set my terms: full transparency, direct oversight, and equity I had earned years ago. Without it, I would walk. They agreed. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Even with that victory, I didn't feel triumphant in the way I expected. What stayed with me wasn't the sight of them falling. It was the quiet knowledge that I had carried the truth alone until it finally became too heavy to ignore. That's what this whole ordeal taught me. Truth is weight. You can bury it for a while, you can paint over it, you can rename it, but sooner or later, it drags everything back to the surface. And when it does, no one walks away untouched. I share this because I know I'm not the only one who's felt invisible at work, watching others twist the story while you hold the facts. If that's you, remember the truth may move slowly, but it never loses its weight. What about you? Have you ever carried a truth that no one wanted to hear?